After Cassidy Hutchinson's stunning testimony, the Secret Service says its agents are also available to testify under oath. But there's no word yet on whether former White House Deputy Chief of Staff Tony Ornato or the Secret Service agent in charge of Trump's detail on January 6th will do that. We welcome back Carol Leonnig, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter for The Washington Post. She wrote the book on the U.S. Secret Service. And Clint Watts, West Point graduate, Army veteran, former FBI special agent, and a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Research Institute. Carol, I want you to give us some background. Who is Robert Engel? What do we need to know about the Secret Service during the Trump presidency?
Great questions, and so concise as you so cleanly are. First off, I'll say, Alicia, the thing that you really need to know, we all need to keep in mind about the Secret Service during the Trump administration is that, you know, president to president, there can be some loyalists that stick by a particular president, but Donald Trump politicized the Secret Service in a way that no other president had before. The most similar situation might have been President Nixon, who tried to use Secret Service agents as spies on some of his political opponents, candidates for president. He tried to install agents he thought were loyal to him to sort of catch them in the act of something bad and report back to him. Donald Trump politicized this agency by installing as his White House Deputy Chief of Staff the former head of his Secret Service detail. That person, Tony Ornato, eventually basically becomes the de facto director of the Secret Service. He's the one who makes sure events, photo ops, special things that are going to help the president get elected get done by the Secret Service. Bobby Engel was the Secret Service's detail leader for the president, and essentially at this point working for Tony Ornato. I mean, not in name, but in reality, working for Tony Ornato.
I mean, Clint, I would love for you to just weigh in on how unusual that is. But I also want to talk about the fact that you have the right today challenging the veracity of some of yesterday's testimony. But we're not getting a lot of pushback on the actual security situation that day. And I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, Alicia, I think there'll probably be some actual written details. Usually in any sort of security plan for an event like January 6th, there'll be some sort of operational planning, an actual write-up that can be referred to. And you'll see some sort of a plan set up. Magnetometers were discussed during the hearing, which are a normal thing that someone would use to try and prevent weapons from getting very close to the president or anywhere near any sort of government buildings. Those plans should be somewhere, and I think they would be something that would be subpoenaed by the committee if they wanted to get more details on what that plan was and why it did or did not follow protocol. I think separately, as Carol talked about, throughout any presidential administration, there's quite a bit of bonding that goes in between a Secret Service detail and the very person that they're willing to give their life to protect. I don't think that's unusual, but what I do think is unusual is in this Trump administration, how people were pulled out of acting government positions, pushed into what are really just White House staff positions. And it also really starts to erode the integrity of these institutions. That was a consistent theme throughout all of the Trump administration, whether it was the Department of Defense, law enforcement, whatever it might be. The Trump administration was always trying to bring them in to be their law enforcement, their military guys. And that's what caused so many problems across the U.S. government in that 4-year period.
Carol, to this whole conversation about what is usual and unusual, the New York Times points out the willingness of the agents to provide potentially critical details about the person they were protecting marks a rare turn for an agency that has historically prioritized the secrecy of presidents, even in the face of investigations. Carol, just how unusual is it for the Secret Service to offer up any specifics about what it does?
You know, I have to grin a little bit about this because over the decades, the Secret Service and many of its directors, starting actually with the Whitewater and Monica Lewinsky investigation under President Clinton, have derided agents who share any details, any confidences they learn at the side or the shoulder of the president. The goal is smart. It's you don't want a president thinking that the guys who are right next to him are absorbing his secrets and gossiping about them later. You want the confidence of those individuals because you want those individuals close. But I grin because the Secret Service doesn't want any details shared except apparently those that are flattering to the president and flattering to the Secret Service. That's one of the stunners for me in exploring this agency. You know, they didn't want any detail agents interviewed by Kenneth Starr about whether or not the president had lied about being alone with Monica Lewinsky, which he had. And they don't want people sharing any details about things that are unflattering to President Trump. But here now we have an agency that says, wait a minute, we dispute Cassidy Hutchinson's account, which she makes clear as secondhand, and we are willing to say that we were in a car with the president and no such attack took place. The president didn't do anything except get angry that he wasn't allowed to travel to the Capitol as he insisted on doing. And I just want to say one more thing about, in some respects, how while this story is salacious and lurid and the source of amazing media treatment, right, including by my newspaper, the things that Cassidy Hutchinson said that she witnessed firsthand are the most dramatic, right? The president attacking a federal officer is a shocker if true. But the president telling the Secret Service not to mag people who had firearms so that he could speak to them, have a better rally, and then send them to the Capitol armed is really the undisputed stunner.
I would add a layer to that, Clint, which is all the talk about the Oath Keepers hearing the word Proud Boy closer to the planning of the January 6th rally when Mr. Giuliani would be around. I mean, members of those groups are already facing charges of seditious conspiracy. Do you think this testimony then weighs in?
I absolutely do. I think there are two parts to it. We already had seen from both the documentary footage and from evidence over the last few weeks that the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, Rhodes and Tarrio, had linked up in a garage. There was obviously some sort of coordination and planning. I think in both of the indictments, when you read them, the text communications that have come forward through it clearly show that they have some sort of an informant on the inside that's providing them some sort of information, or they have worked with somebody as a cooperating witness for reduced charges. And then you start to expand that out. The most key person to me, which was out in the open on January 5th and 6th, is Roger Stone. Showed up consistently there. And then we also saw discussions during Hutchinson's testimony of Michael Flynn. So when you look at those people that were at the rally, those that were connected to these Praetorian Guard type groups that were guarding them and leading them into rallies, into and around the White House, into and around the Capitol, I think those are the key linkages that were really missing up to this point, because they had not been flushed out in the indictments that we had seen out of the DOJ. So I thought this, one of these things from the hearing that is probably most important are these connections between the White House and these militia groups. I think that will get flushed out in the coming weeks. And that's really where the ties are. We're talking about insurrection. We're talking about violence. I'm much more interested in that than whether there was some sort of argument in a sedan with the president.